I walked into that courtroom knowing they wanted me, broken cameras, flashing whispers, rippling through the gallery, my own son sitting just a few rows away with his lawyer beside him and his wife gripping his arm like a victory was already secured. They had rehearsed this moment, planned it down to the smallest detail. The goal was simple: strip me of my dignity. Declare me bankrupt in public and walk away believing they had finally erased me. I could feel the weight of every stare, the quiet satisfaction on their faces, and the certainty that I had already lost. But here is what they never understood. Humiliation only works when the truth is fragile, and mine was not. I had stayed silent for years while they rewrote the story, painted me as weak, careless, irresponsible, a burden who deserved what was coming, and I let them. Because some lessons require patience, and some traps only close when the other side believes they are winning. Then the judge leaned forward and asked one question, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, and in that instant everything shifted. My son froze, his wife's confidence shattered, and their lawyer went pale, as if he had just realized the ground beneath him was gone. That question did not just stop the trial. It peeled back years of lies, exposed a plan they thought no one would ever see, and revealed why I walked into that courtroom calm while they walked in hungry. If you stay with me, you will see how betrayal turns into panic, how public shame becomes public reckoning, and how the people who tried to bankrupt me learned far too late that I was never the one in danger at all. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I'm 68 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years designing and inspecting bridges across 3 states. I built structures meant to carry people safely from one side to another, and I took pride in every calculation, every beam, every bolt that held firm under pressure. I never imagined that one day I would walk into a courtroom where my own son was trying to tear down the only bridge that ever truly mattered to me, my dignity. The county courthouse smelled of old wood and fresh anxiety. I pushed through the double doors and stepped into the main hallway where the morning light fell in pale rectangles across the marble floor. Cameras flashed before I could take 3 steps. A reporter thrust a microphone toward my face, asking something about the case, about my family, about whether I had any comment. I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence carries more weight than noise, especially when the noise is designed to make you stumble. I knew Vanessa had called them. She wanted witnesses. She wanted the whole town to see the moment her father-in-law was declared incompetent, unfit to manage his own affairs, a burden to be handled rather than a man to be respected. She had always been thorough, my daughter-in-law. Every cruelty she committed came wrapped in careful planning. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches that creaked when people shifted and a ceiling fan that turned slowly, pushing warm air in lazy circles. I walked down the center aisle, keeping my gaze forward. I could feel eyes on me from both sides, neighbors and strangers gathered to watch a family destroy itself in public. Some of them probably felt sorry for me. Others were just here for the spectacle. I didn't blame either group. When you reach my age, you understand that people are complicated, and judgment is a luxury I could no longer afford. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table with Vanessa beside him. My son wore a dark suit I had never seen before, probably purchased for this occasion. He looked older than his 43 years, his shoulders hunched slightly forward, as if the weight of what he was doing had already begun to press down on him. He didn't look at me when I entered. He studied the table in front of him, his hands folded, his jaw tight. I wanted to believe that meant something. I wanted to believe there was still a part of him that remembered who I was, who he used to be. But wanting and believing are not the same thing, and I had spent the last 6 months learning the difference. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked directly at me. She wore a modest navy dress, the kind designed to make a woman appear trustworthy and concerned. Her expression was soft, almost sad, as if she were attending a funeral rather than orchestrating one. She had mastered that look years ago. I'd seen it at family dinners, when she delivered insults disguised as jokes at holidays, when she whispered suggestions that somehow became demands. She was 41 years old and had spent 14 of those years slowly tightening her grip on my son until he no longer recognized the shape of his own hands. Their attorney, Gregory Hale, sat at the end of the table with a thick folder open in front of him. He was a broad man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases against people who cannot afford to fight back. He glanced at me as I took my seat at the defendant's table, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not respect exactly, more like the mild curiosity a cat shows before batting at something smaller than itself. I sat down alone. The chair was hard, the wood worn smooth by years of people sitting exactly where I sat, waiting for their lives to be weighed and measured by strangers. I folded my hands on the table and kept my breathing steady. I had spent 4 decades calculating stress loads and failure points. I knew how to stay calm when everything around me threatened to collapse. The clerk stood and read the petition aloud. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. Conservatorship of Thomas Whitaker, diminished mental capacity, financial mismanagement. I heard whispers behind me, the soft hiss of speculation and pity. I did not turn around. I did not react. I simply watched as Judge Eleanor Whitman, a composed woman of about 60 with reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewed the filing with an expression that revealed nothing. Gregory Hale shifted in his seat, ready to begin his performance. Vanessa touched Daniel's arm, a gesture meant to look supportive, but which I recognized as a command: stay focused, stay quiet, let the lawyer do the work. Then Judge Whitman looked up from the file. She removed her glasses slowly, set them on the bench, and fixed her gaze not on me, not on my attorney, but directly on Daniel and Vanessa. The courtroom fell silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen every kind of lie dressed up as truth, "I have one preliminary question for the petitioners." The judge's question hung in the air, but my mind had already begun to drift backward, pulled by the gravity of memory toward the moment when all of this truly began. I sat in that courtroom watching Daniel avoid my eyes, and I remembered another day, 6 months earlier, when he had looked at me with what I thought was love but now understood was something else entirely. It was April, and the dogwoods were blooming along the street where I had lived for 32 years. The house still held Helen's presence in every corner, and the curtains she had chosen, and the garden she had planted, and the photographs that lined the hallway like a timeline of our life together. She had been gone for 5 years by then, but I still spoke to her sometimes in the quiet hours of the morning, telling her about my day as if she might answer. I suppose that sounds like the habit of a lonely old man, and perhaps it was. But loneliness is not the same as weakness, no matter what certain people might want a court to believe. Daniel arrived that Saturday afternoon with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. He came alone, which should have been my first warning. Vanessa rarely let him visit without her supervision, and when she did, it usually meant she had already accomplished whatever she needed through other means. But I was happy to see my son happy enough that I did not ask questions I should have asked. We sat at the kitchen table where I had taught him to play chess when he was 9 years old. He set the envelope between us and smiled, though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "I've been working with a financial planner," he said. "Just getting everything organized for the future. You know, estate planning, making sure all the paperwork is in order." He slid the envelope toward me. "There are a few documents that need your signature. Routine stuff, Dad. Nothing complicated." I trusted my son. That is a simple sentence, but it contains the entire architecture of my mistake. I trusted him because he was my child, because I had held him the day he was born and watched him take his first steps and cheered at his college graduation. I trusted him because trusting your children is what parents do, even when those children have grown into strangers wearing familiar faces. So I opened the envelope and glanced at the pages inside, and when Daniel pointed to the signature lines, I signed. I did not read the fine print. I did not notice the clause that granted him power of attorney over my affairs in the event of incapacity. I simply signed because my son asked me to, and I believed he was trying to help. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Vanessa invited me to dinner at their house. The dining room was decorated in the cold, modern style Vanessa preferred: all sharp angles and neutral colors, nothing soft enough to feel like home. She had prepared a roast that was slightly overdone, though I complimented it anyway. Good manners cost nothing, and I had learned long ago that keeping peace with Vanessa required constant small surrenders. After the meal, while Daniel cleared the plates, Vanessa leaned toward me with an expression of gentle concern. "Dad, we've been worried about you," she said. "Managing the house, the bills, the investments, it must be so much stress. You've worked hard your whole life. You deserve to relax." She reached across the table and touched my hand, a gesture that felt rehearsed, like something she had practiced in front of a mirror. "Let us handle things for you. We just want to make your life easier." I looked at Daniel, expecting him to soften her words or add some context. Instead, he nodded quickly, too quickly, as if he had been waiting for his cue. "She's right, Dad. You shouldn't have to worry about any of this." His voice carried an odd flatness, the tone of someone reciting lines rather than speaking from the heart. I thanked them for their concern and said I would think about it. But something had shifted in my chest, a small, cold weight that I could not name. I excused myself to use the bathroom, and as I walked down the hallway, I heard their voices drifting from the kitchen. They must have thought I was out of earshot. They must have believed the walls were thick enough to contain their secrets. "This is the best path for everyone," Daniel said. His voice was low but clear. "He'll understand eventually." I stopped walking. I stood in that hallway with my hand on the wall, listening to my son talk about me as if I were a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. I waited for Vanessa to respond, but she said nothing. Perhaps she simply nodded. Perhaps she smiled. I did not see her face, but I did not need to. I had heard enough. I returned to the dining room and finished my coffee and made polite conversation for another hour. I hugged my son at the door and told him I loved him because despite everything that was still true. Then I drove home through the dark streets, past the houses of neighbors who had known me for decades, past the church where Helen and I were married, past all the landmarks of a life I thought I understood. That night I told myself my son was just trying to help, but something in his voice had sounded like rehearsal, not reassurance. The memory of that night faded as the courtroom pulled me back to the present. Judge Whitman had asked her question, and now Gregory Hale was rising to respond, his voice smooth and practiced. But I found myself thinking not about his words, but about the woman sitting beside my son. The woman who had orchestrated every step that led me to this wooden chair in this cold room. Vanessa had been building toward this moment for years. I simply had not been paying attention. The signs had always been there, scattered across 14 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings like breadcrumbs I refused to follow. I remembered a Christmas perhaps 8 years ago when the whole family had gathered at Daniel and Vanessa's house. Helen was still alive then, though her health had already begun its slow decline. We sat around their dining table surrounded by expensive decorations that sparkled without warmth, eating a meal that looked beautiful but tasted like obligation. I had offered to carve the turkey, a task I'd performed at every family Christmas since Daniel was a boy. It was tradition, a small ritual that connected the present to the past. I picked up the carving knife and began to work, and Vanessa laughed from across the table. "Careful, Dad," she said, her voice bright with false cheer. "That knife is sharper than your memory these days." Everyone laughed. Daniel laughed. Even some of Helen's relatives chuckled politely, not wanting to create awkwardness. But beneath the table, Helen found my hand and squeezed it once, a silent acknowledgement that she had heard what I heard. The joke was not a joke. It was a test, a small cruelty disguised as humor, designed to see how much I would tolerate without pushing back. I smiled and continued carving. I tolerated it, and Vanessa filed away that information for future use. There were other moments too many to catalog, comments about my driving, my cooking, my ability to remember appointments. Each one delivered with a smile, each one carrying a tiny payload of poison. She was patient, my daughter-in-law. She understood that large cruelties attract attention, but small ones accumulate in the shadows until they become impossible to separate from the truth. Helen saw it more clearly than I did. She always had a gift for reading people, for sensing the architecture beneath the surface. I remember one evening a few months before she entered hospice, when we sat together on the back porch watching the sun go down. She had been quiet for a long time, and then she said almost to herself, "That woman reminds me of someone I read about." I asked her what she meant. She shook her head slowly and said it was nothing, just a thought. I should have pressed her. I should have asked who Vanessa reminded her of, what article or book had planted that seed of recognition in my wife's mind. But I let the moment pass because the evening was peaceful, and I did not want to disturb it with difficult conversations. Now, sitting in this courtroom, I wished I had been braver. Helen had seen something I missed, and she had tried to warn me in her gentle way. I simply had not been listening. Gregory Hale's voice cut through my thoughts. He had finished his preliminary response to the judge and was now presenting what he called evidence of my mental decline. He held up documents, like a magician revealing cards, each one designed to make me look confused, irresponsible, unfit. "Your Honor, we have records showing that Mr. Whitaker missed 3 medical appointments in the past 4 months," Hale said. He did not mention that Vanessa had called to cancel those appointments herself, claiming to be my caregiver. We have a bounced check from his personal account indicating an inability to manage basic finances. He did not mention that Vanessa had transferred funds out of that account 2 days before the check was due to clear. I had not known about the transfer until Rebecca showed me the records. Then came the testimony read aloud from a written statement. A concerned neighbor named Patricia Owens described seeing me wander in my yard at odd hours talking to myself, forgetting to bring in my mail for days at a time. I knew Patricia Owens. She had moved in 3 years ago, and within 6 months, she and Vanessa had become close friends. They had lunch together regularly. They exchanged Christmas cards. And now Patricia was providing testimony to help lock me away. I sat very still as Hale presented each piece of fabricated evidence. I watched Vanessa's face, the careful mask of concern she wore like a costume. She believed she had thought of everything. She believed her trap was flawless, every thread carefully woven, every exit sealed. She had built this trap piece by piece. But what she did not know was that someone else had been building something 15 years before I ever saw it coming. Gregory Hale continued his performance, but I was no longer fully present in that courtroom. My body sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded, my expression carefully neutral. But my mind had traveled backward 5 months to a small law office on the second floor of a building I had never entered before, where I first understood that Helen's love had not ended with her death. I had found the business card tucked inside a book on my shelf, a volume of poetry Helen had given me for our 40th anniversary. I didn't know how long it had been there. The card was simple, cream-colored with a name printed in modest letters, Rebecca Hill, attorney at law, specializing in elder law and estate protection. On the back in Helen's handwriting were 4 words, call her when ready. For weeks I carried that card in my wallet without acting on it. I was not sure what ready meant or how I would know when the moment had arrived. Then Daniel asked me to sign those documents, and Vanessa began her campaign of small humiliations, and I heard my son's voice in that hallway saying I would understand eventually. That night, I took out the card and dialed the number. Rebecca Hill's office was nothing like the polished spaces where attorneys usually conducted business. The furniture was practical. The walls lined with law books and framed certificates, the desk cluttered with files that suggested she cared more about her work than her appearance. She was 35 years old, with dark hair pulled back from a face that reminded me of someone I could not quite place. Her eyes were sharp and calm, the eyes of a woman who had learned to listen before speaking. She stood when I entered and shook my hand with a firm grip. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "please sit down. My grandmother told me about you. She said if you ever called, I should clear my schedule." I lowered myself into the chair across from her desk. "Your grandmother, Margaret Hill." Rebecca smiled, and in that smile I finally recognized the resemblance. Margaret had been Helen's closest friend for over 40 years, the woman who stood beside her at our wedding and held her hand during the final days of her illness. I had not seen Margaret since the funeral, though she had sent cards on holidays and left messages I never returned. Grief had made me withdraw from everyone who reminded me of what I had lost. "Helen and my grandmother were like sisters," Rebecca continued. "They planned for a lot of things together, including the possibility that you might one day need protection from people who were supposed to love you." She opened a folder on her desk. "Tell me what's been happening." I told her everything. The documents Daniel asked me to sign, Vanessa's comments and suggestions. The feeling that something was being constructed around me, a cage built so slowly I had not noticed the bars until they were nearly complete. Rebecca listened without interruption, taking occasional notes, her expression growing more focused with each detail. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "What your daughter-in-law is attempting is called conservatorship abuse. It's more common than people think, especially targeting elderly individuals with assets. The goal is to have you declared mentally incompetent so they can take control of your finances, your property, your decisions." She paused. "But we can prepare. We can build a defense they won't see coming." I asked her how she knew what Vanessa was planning before I had even described it fully. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "My grandmother recognized the pattern years ago. She and Helen discussed it, made contingency plans, established certain protections. Helen never wanted to burden you with suspicions that might have been wrong. But she wanted to make sure that if she was right, you would have somewhere to turn. The weight of those words settled over me like a blanket. Helen had seen this coming. She had prepared for it not out of paranoia, but out of love, the same love that had guided every decision she made throughout our marriage. Even in death, she was still protecting me. Rebecca outlined her strategy with precision. From this moment forward, you do not confront them. You do not argue. You do not defend yourself against their accusations. Let them believe you are exactly what they want you to be, a confused old man who doesn't understand what's happening. She met my eyes. Every move they make from now on is evidence. Every lie, every manipulation, every forged document. We document everything. When the time comes, we will have a record so complete that no judge in this country could ignore it. For 5 months, I followed her instructions. I played the role Vanessa had written for me, the declining patriarch who needed guidance and supervision. I signed papers when asked. I accepted insults with quiet resignation. I let them believe they were winning because every victory they claimed was another piece of evidence we collected. The confused old man they saw was a performance. The real Thomas Whitaker was taking notes. They thought I had no one. They thought I was alone. They had no idea that Helen's best friend had been watching over me since the day my wife closed her eyes. Helen's protection had reached across 5 years of silence to find me in my darkest hour. Sitting in that courtroom watching Rebecca prepare her notes and Gregory Hale shuffle his fabricated evidence, I found myself returning to the night when my wife said goodbye. Some memories fade with time, their edges softening until they become gentle impressions rather than vivid scenes. But Helen's last night remained sharp in my mind, every word preserved like text carved into stone. We had brought her home from the hospital 3 weeks before the end. She had asked for that, had insisted on it with a firmness that surprised the doctors. "I want to die in my own bed," she said. "I want to see my garden through the window. I want to smell coffee in the morning and hear Thomas humming while he reads the paper." The hospice nurses came twice a day, and I learned to adjust the morphine drip and change the sheets without waking her, and sit for hours holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. On the last night, she was more lucid than she had been in days. The medication had eased her pain without clouding her mind, and when I came to sit beside her after dinner, her eyes were clear and focused. The bedroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the oxygen machine and the distant sound of crickets through the open window. She had always loved that sound, had said it reminded her of summer nights when we were young and the future stretched out before us like an endless road. She reached for my hand and I took it carefully, afraid of hurting her fragile bones. Her skin was paper thin, marked with bruises from the IV lines, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. "I need to tell you something. I need you to promise me." I leaned closer. "Anything. When the time comes, find Margaret." She paused, gathering strength. "She has something for you, something I prepared. You'll know when you need it." I did not understand. Margaret Hill had been Helen's friend since before I met either of them, a bond forged in college and strengthened over decades of shared joys and sorrows. But Helen spoke as if Margaret held more than memories, as if she were the keeper of secrets I had never been told. "What do you mean?" I asked. "What did you prepare?" Helen's eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my chest ache. "I know things about Vanessa," she said. "Things I never told you. I didn't want to hurt Daniel. He loves her, or he thinks he does, and I couldn't bear to be the one who destroyed that for him." Her grip tightened on my hand. "But if she ever tries to take everything from you, if she ever moves against you after I'm gone, Margaret knows what to do. I made sure of it." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood about our life together. Helen had been watching preparing building defenses I never knew existed. She had seen something in Vanessa that I had dismissed as mere coldness, and she had spent years constructing protections against a threat I refused to acknowledge. "I don't understand," I said. "What did you see? What do you know?" She smiled, then a small, sad smile that held both love and resignation. "You'll understand when you need to. Not before." She lifted her other hand and touched my cheek, her fingers cool against my skin. "You always want to see the best in people, Thomas. It's one of the things I love most about you. But some people don't have a best to see. Some people only have appetites dressed up in manners. Her voice was fading, the effort of speaking, draining her remaining strength. Promise me you'll find Margaret. Promise me you'll trust what she gives you. I promised. I would have promised her anything in that moment, would have sworn any oath she asked. She nodded slowly, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Within an hour, she had slipped back into the shallow sleep that would carry her through her final days. She never spoke with such clarity again. 3 days later, she was gone. After the funeral, after the mourners had departed and the casseroles had been eaten and the sympathy cards had been stacked on the kitchen counter, I went through Helen's belongings. In the drawer of her nightstand beneath a Bible and a stack of photographs, I found a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, along with 4 words that stopped my heart: open when you need strength. I held that envelope for a long time, running my fingers over the seal, wondering what words she had left for me. But something held me back. Perhaps I was afraid of what I might find, afraid that her final message would make her absence more real than I could bear. Perhaps I simply was not ready to hear whatever truth she had preserved. I placed the envelope in my desk drawer and closed it, telling myself I would open it someday when the time was right. For 5 years, I kept my promise. I never opened that envelope. But sitting in that courtroom watching my son betray me and his wife smile with quiet satisfaction, I finally understood. Helen had seen this day coming long before I did. The memory of Helen's envelope burned in my mind as I returned my attention to the present. Gregory Hale had risen from his chair and was now standing before the judge, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. He moved with theatrical precision, each gesture calculated to project authority and competence. I had seen his type before in boardrooms and contract negotiations, men who mistook volume for truth and polish for substance. They were dangerous, but only until someone called their bluff. Your Honor. Hale began, his voice filling the courtroom with practiced ease. We have compiled extensive documentation demonstrating Mr. Whitaker's progressive mental decline and his inability to manage his own financial affairs. He lifted a stack of papers from his table and approached the bench. I would like to submit these bank statements as Exhibit A. Judge Whitman accepted the documents and began reviewing them. Hale continued his narration, pointing to highlighted lines and circled figures. As you can see, there is a pattern of erratic spending over the past 18 months. Unexplained withdrawals, duplicate payments to the same vendors, a significant transfer to an account Mr. Whitaker cannot identify. He paused for effect. These are not the actions of a man in full possession of his faculties. I knew those statements intimately. Rebecca and I had reviewed every transaction Hale was now presenting as evidence of my confusion. The unexplained withdrawals were cash I had taken for groceries and household expenses, the same amounts I had withdrawn every month for 40 years. The duplicate payments were a clerical error by my utility company that had been corrected within a week. The significant transfer was a donation I had made to a veterans charity in honor of my late brother. Every item Hale presented as proof of decline was in reality proof of nothing except Vanessa's skill at reframing ordinary life as pathology. Additionally, Hale said, producing another document with a flourish, we have obtained a medical assessment from Dr. William Porter, a respected psychiatrist who evaluated Mr. Whitaker 3 months ago. He handed the paper to the judge. Dr. Porter's findings indicate early-stage cognitive decline consistent with the beginnings of dementia. He recommends supervised management of Mr. Whitaker's affairs to prevent further deterioration. I had never met Dr. William Porter. I had never been evaluated by any psychiatrist. Rebecca had already traced the connection. Dr. Porter shared office space with a physician who had treated Vanessa for a minor procedure 2 years ago. The evaluation was a fiction, purchased and fabricated, another brick in the wall Vanessa had constructed around me. Hale's presentation continued for another 20 minutes, each piece of evidence delivered with the same smooth confidence. He spoke of my isolation, my confusion, my vulnerability to exploitation by outside parties. He painted a picture of a feeble old man wandering through life without direction, desperately in need of the guidance only his loving family could provide. It was a masterful performance, convincing in its details and emotionally compelling in its delivery. If I had not known the truth, I might have believed it myself. Then, Judge Whitman interrupted. She had been reviewing the document silently, her expression revealing nothing, but now she looked up with a slight furrow in her brow. Mr. Hale, I notice your filing references Mr. Whitaker's assets in general terms, but I don't see any documentation regarding the Whitaker Family Trust. She flipped through several pages. Your petition claims authority over all of Mr. Whitaker's financial holdings. Yet there's no mention of this specific instrument. Can you provide those records? Hale's rhythm faltered for the first time. He glanced back at Vanessa, who sat very still at the plaintiff's table. A small shake of her head, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. So did Rebecca, who made a quiet note on her legal pad. Your Honor, Hale said, recovering quickly. We were not able to locate those particular records during our discovery process. We believe they may have been misplaced or perhaps never properly filed. Judge Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly. A trust document that was never properly filed, that seems unusual for an instrument of this nature. She made her own note. We'll return to this matter. Please continue. Hale nodded and resumed his presentation, but the smoothness had cracked. He spoke a little faster now, his gestures a little less assured. He did not know what he did not know, and that uncertainty had begun to show. I turned my attention to Daniel. My son sat beside Vanessa with his hands flat on the table, his shoulders rigid. When Hale spoke about protecting me from myself, Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. He didn't look like a concerned son worried about his father's welfare. He looked like a man carrying a weight he had agreed to bear but had not fully understood until this moment. His eyes moved to Vanessa, then to Hale, then to the floor. He was calculating, measuring, wondering, perhaps, if the plan he had helped design was worth the price he was now paying. I remembered his words from that hallway 6 months ago. This is the best path for everyone. He'll understand eventually. He had not sounded uncertain then. He had sounded like a man who had made his choice and accepted its consequences. But consequences have a way of growing heavier than anticipated, and I could see that weight pressing down on him now. Gregory Hale thought he had every document that mattered, but there was one file he never requested because he didn't know it existed. The missing trust document hung in the air like an unanswered accusation. But Gregory Hale pressed forward as if the crack in his case were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He spent another 15 minutes presenting testimony from neighbors and acquaintances, each statement carefully curated to paint me as a man in decline. A woman from my church described me as forgetful during a committee meeting. A former colleague mentioned that I had seemed distracted at a retirement luncheon. Each observation was trivial on its own, but Hale wove them together into a tapestry of incompetence, his voice rising and falling with theatrical precision. When he finally concluded, he returned to his seat with the satisfied expression of a man who believed his work was done. Vanessa touched his arm briefly, a gesture of approval and ownership. Daniel stared at the table, his fingers interlaced so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Judge Whitman let the silence stretch for a long moment. She reviewed her notes, flipping pages with deliberate slowness, her face revealing nothing. The courtroom waited. I could hear the soft rustle of people shifting in their seats, the distant hum of the ventilation system, the faint scratch of a reporter's pen against paper. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation overhead, indifferent to the tension gathering below. Then the judge removed her glasses. She set them on the bench with a small click that seemed to echo through the room. When she looked up, she did not address Gregory Hale. She did not look at Vanessa or at me or at Rebecca. Her gaze fixed directly on Daniel, and something in her expression made my son sit up straighter, his shoulders pulling back as if bracing for impact. Mr. Daniel Whitaker. Judge Whitman said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that demanded attention. I have a simple question for you. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. He glanced at Hale, who offered nothing but a confused frown. Vanessa's hand moved toward Daniel's arm, but stopped short, hovering in the space between them. The courtroom held its breath. In the past 3 years, the judge continued, each word measured and precise. How many times have you visited your father's home for a meal, a conversation, or simply to check on his well-being? She paused, letting the question settle, without any discussion of finances, property, or inheritance. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in a courtroom. It was not the silence of anticipation or the silence of respect. It was the silence of exposure, the moment when a carefully constructed facade begins to crumble and everyone present understands that something fundamental has shifted. Daniel opened his mouth. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He looked at Vanessa, whose face had gone pale beneath her careful makeup. He looked at Gregory Hale, who was already rising to object but seemed uncertain on what grounds. He looked at the judge, at the gallery, at everywhere except at me. 5 seconds passed. I counted them in heartbeats. 10 seconds. The murmuring in the gallery grew louder, a wave of whispered speculation rolling through the rows of observers. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. Still Daniel said nothing. "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Whitman prompted, "it's a simple question. Surely you can recall visiting your own father." Daniel swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly, and when he finally spoke, his voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. I don't recall specifically, Your Honor." Judge Whitman wrote something on her notepad. The scratch of her pen was the only sound in the room for several seconds. When she looked up again, her expression had not changed, but something in her eyes had hardened a judgment forming that no legal argument could reverse. "You don't recall," she repeated. "You are petitioning this court to take control of your father's entire life, his finances, his property, his autonomy, and you cannot recall when you last visited him simply as his son." She let the question hang in the air. Not to discuss money, not to review documents, just to share a meal or ask how he was doing. Daniel's face flushed red. Vanessa's grip finally closed on his arm, her fingers digging into the fabric of his suit jacket. Gregory Hale rose fully now, his voice strained. "Your Honor, I'm not sure how this line of questioning is relevant to the matter at hand." "It is relevant, Mr. Hale, because this petition claims that Mr. Daniel Whitaker and his wife are the appropriate parties to manage Mr. Thomas Whitaker's affairs based on their close family relationship and their intimate knowledge of his needs." Judge Whitman's voice remained level, but her words cut like surgical instruments. Yet the petitioner cannot recall a single instance of visiting his father without an agenda attached. That speaks directly to the nature of this relationship and the motivations behind this filing. I watched my son as the judge spoke. I watched the color drain from his face and the guilt settle into the lines around his eyes. For 43 years I had loved this boy. I had taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him with his homework and cheered at his baseball games. I had walked him down the aisle at his wedding and held his hand when his first child was stillborn and told him that grief was not weakness, but proof of love. I had believed, despite everything, that somewhere inside the man he had become, the boy I raised still existed. But looking at him now, seeing the naked guilt that had nowhere to hide, I understood something I had resisted for months. Daniel had not been manipulated into this courtroom. He had walked in willingly, eyes open, conscience silenced. He had chosen Vanessa's ambition over his father's dignity, and now that choice was written across his face for everyone to see. My son could not answer a simple question about when he last visited me as a father, not as an heir. And in that silence, the courtroom heard what words could never say. The silence left by Daniel's inability to answer stretched into something heavier, a weight that pressed down on everyone in that courtroom. I could see the reporters in the gallery exchanging glances, their pens moving faster across their notebooks. I could see the spectators leaning forward in their seats, sensing that something was about to break. And I could see my son frozen in his chair, like a man who had just realized the ice beneath him was far thinner than he had believed. Rebecca chose that moment to stand. Her movement was unhurried, deliberate, the calm of someone who understood that timing was everything. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "the defense would like to present evidence in response to the petitioner's claims." Judge Whitman nodded. "Proceed." Rebecca lifted a folder from her table and approached the bench. "I am submitting a series of email communications recovered from a cloud storage account registered to Mr. Daniel Whitaker." She handed copies to the judge, to Gregory Hale, and to the court clerk. "These emails, dated approximately 18 months ago, are exchanges between Mr. Daniel Whitaker and Mrs. Vanessa Whitaker. They detail the planning and execution of the conservatorship petition we are here to discuss today." Gregory Hale snatched the papers from Rebecca's hand, his eyes scanning the pages with growing alarm. Vanessa sat rigid in her chair, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges. Daniel stared at the documents as if they were written in a language he had never seen before. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Hale protested, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "We were given no notice of this evidence. We have had no opportunity to verify its authenticity or prepare a response." The evidence was obtained through legal means and authenticated by a certified digital forensics expert, Rebecca replied evenly. I have the full chain of custody documentation here, along with the expert's sworn affidavit confirming that these emails originated from Mr. Daniel Whitaker's personal account and were sent to Mrs. Vanessa Whitaker's account on the dates indicated. She placed another stack of papers on the bench. Mr. Whitaker deleted these emails from his primary device approximately 14 months ago, but they remained preserved in his cloud backup, which he apparently forgot existed. Judge Whitman began reading. The courtroom waited. I watched her face for any sign of reaction, but she maintained her judicial composure, her eyes moving steadily across the pages. When she finally looked up, she turned her gaze not to Rebecca or to Hale, but to Daniel. Mr. Whitaker, she said, would you like to hear what you wrote to your wife on March 15th of last year? Daniel's face had gone the color of old paper. He shook his head slightly, a reflexive denial, but the judge was already reading aloud. We need to move on the conservatorship before he changes the trust. The old man is getting suspicious. Once we control his assets, we can sell the properties and liquidate the investments. He'll never know what happened until it's too late. Judge Whitman paused, letting the words settle into the silence. Vanessa, this has to happen soon. If we wait much longer, he might figure out what we're doing. I've already talked to Hale. He says we need medical documentation. Can you handle that part? The courtroom erupted. Gasps rose from the gallery like a wave breaking against rocks. Reporters scrambled to write down every word. Someone in the back row said, "Oh my God," loudly enough to be heard over the commotion. Gregory Hale sat down heavily in his chair, the papers trembling in his hands. Daniel stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor with a harsh screech. Those are fake. His voice cracked on the last word, rising toward a pitch I had never heard from him before. Someone fabricated those emails. This is a setup. She's working with him to destroy us. Judge Whitman's gaze silenced him more effectively than any gavel could have. Sit down, Mr. Whitaker. Her voice was ice. You will have an opportunity to respond through your counsel, but I warn you that any further outbursts will result in contempt charges. Daniel remained standing for a moment longer, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Vanessa reached up and pulled at his arm, hissing something I could not hear. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself back into his chair. His hands were shaking visibly now, the tremors running up his arms like fault lines spreading through unstable ground. Rebecca continued as if the interruption had not occurred. Your Honor, the authentication records confirm that these emails were composed on Mr. Daniel Whitaker's personal laptop, using his registered IP address and sent through his verified email account. The metadata is intact and has not been altered. The forensics expert is available to testify if the court requires additional confirmation. Judge Whitman reviewed the authentication documents, her expression hardening with each page. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at Daniel with something that might have been pity if it were not so thoroughly mixed with contempt. It appears, Mr. Whitaker, that you did not merely participate in this scheme. You initiated it. You planned it. You directed your wife to obtain fraudulent medical documentation, and you attempted to destroy the evidence of your own involvement. She turned to Gregory Hale. Counselor, I suggest you take a moment to consult with your clients about how they wish to proceed, because this petition is standing on very thin ice. I sat motionless at the defendant's table, watching the destruction unfold. I had prepared for this moment. With Rebecca, had known what the emails would reveal, had steeled myself for the confirmation of my worst suspicions. But preparation is not the same as experience. Knowing something in your mind is different from feeling it in your bones. For years I had told myself a story. The story said that Daniel was weak, not wicked. That Vanessa had manipulated him, twisted his love for her into a weapon against his own father. That somewhere inside the man who sat across the courtroom, the boy I had raised, still existed, buried but not destroyed. I had clung to that story because the alternative was too painful to accept. But the emails told a different story. They told the truth. Daniel had not been manipulated. He had not been coerced or deceived or pressured into betraying me. He had conceived the plan himself, had calculated the timing, had directed his wife like a general directing troops. The son I thought I knew had looked at his father and seen not a man to be loved, but an obstacle to be removed, an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be solved. I felt no triumph watching his mask fall away. I felt no satisfaction hearing his desperate lies collapse under the weight of evidence. What I felt was cold clarity, the kind that comes when you finally stop hoping for something that was never going to happen. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle was gone. The child I read bedtime stories to had vanished somewhere along the way. In his place sat a stranger who had planned to erase my autonomy for money. I always believed Vanessa had corrupted my son, but the emails proved the truth. I could not face Daniel had not been manipulated. He had been the architect all along. Judge Whitman called a 15-minute recess. The words fell into the courtroom like stones into water, sending ripples of movement and murmured conversation through the gallery. Spectators stood and stretched. Reporters hurried toward the doors, phones already pressed to their ears. The bailiff opened a side entrance to allow air into the stuffy room. I remained seated watching Daniel and Vanessa gather their things with the jerky movements of people whose world had just shifted beneath their feet. Rebecca touched my arm. "Stay here. I need to file some paperwork with the clerk." She gathered her documents and moved toward the front of the room, leaving me alone at the defendant's table. I waited until the crowd had thinned before rising. My legs felt stiff from sitting, and I walked slowly toward the hallway, partly to stretch my muscles, and partly because I knew what I would find there. Some instincts sharpen with age. After 68 years of reading people, of calculating stress loads and failure points in structures both physical and human, I developed a sense for when something was about to crack. The hallway outside the courtroom was lined with wooden benches and tall windows that let in pale autumn light. A few people milled about checking phones or speaking in low voices. I spotted Daniel and Vanessa near the far end, standing close together in what appeared to be an intimate conversation. But as I drew nearer, staying close to the wall and moving quietly, I heard the intimacy was of a different kind entirely. "You said you deleted everything." Vanessa's voice was a hiss, sharp and venomous. Her composure had shattered completely, her face twisted with fury. "You promised me those emails were gone. You looked me in the eye and swore there was no trail." Daniel's response came fast and hot. "I did delete them. How was I supposed to know about some cloud backup? You think I'm a computer expert?" He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping but his anger rising. "And don't you dare put this all on me. This was your idea too. You're the one who said we needed to move fast. You're the one who found Hale and set up the fake medical report. So don't stand there acting like I'm the villain when you were right beside me the whole time." "Keep your voice down," Vanessa snapped, glancing around. Her eyes found mine. I had stopped walking. I stood perhaps 20 feet away, close enough to have heard every word, my face carefully neutral. For a long moment, the three of us formed a frozen tableau, the father, the son, the woman who had helped tear them apart. Then Daniel turned and saw me too, and whatever color remained in his face drained away completely. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. The cracks in their united front had become chasms visible now to anyone who cared to look. I held my son's gaze for 3 heartbeats, then continued walking past them toward the water fountain at the end of the hall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of their silence said everything. When I returned to the courtroom, I found Gregory Hale engaged in urgent conversation with the judge's clerk. His confident posture had collapsed entirely. He leaned forward over the clerk's desk, speaking in low tones, his hands gesturing with increasing agitation. "Surely the court can grant a brief continuance," he was saying. "Given the unexpected nature of this evidence, my clients deserve time to prepare a proper response." The clerk, a middle-aged woman with the patient expression of someone who had heard every excuse and believed none of them, shook her head. "Judge Whitman has denied the request. The hearing will resume as scheduled." Hale straightened, running a hand through his silver hair. For the first time since the proceedings began, he looked like what he was, a lawyer who had taken a case based on false assurances and was now watching it disintegrate in public. He walked back to the plaintiff's table with the heavy steps of a man marching toward his own professional humiliation. Rebecca returned to our table and settled into her chair beside me. She had witnessed the exchange with Hale, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "They're panicking," she whispered. I nodded slowly. "Good. Let them." She studied my face for a long moment. There must have been something in my expression, some quality of calm, that seemed out of place given the circumstances. Most men would be trembling with vindication or burning with righteous anger. I felt neither. What I felt was the quiet satisfaction of watching a structure perform exactly as designed, every load distributed, every stress anticipated, every failure point reinforced long before the pressure arrived. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Rebecca asked. Her voice was soft, meant only for me. "Not just hoped, knew." I did not answer. Some truths are better left unspoken until the moment they are needed. Daniel and Vanessa returned to the courtroom separately, entering through different doors, taking their seats without looking at each other. The alliance that had brought them here was fracturing in real time, and everyone in the room could see it. Gregory Hale shuffled his papers with none of his earlier confidence, his eyes darting between his clients as if calculating whether either of them was worth saving. Judge Whitman entered through her private door, and the bailiff called for everyone to rise. We stood then, sat again as she settled into her chair and reviewed her notes. The ceiling fan continued its lazy rotation. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor. I folded my hands on the table and waited. The judge opened her mouth to speak, but before she could form the first word, the bailiff stepped forward. He had received a note from someone near the back of the courtroom, and his voice carried clearly through the silence. "Your Honor, there is an additional witness who has arrived and requests permission to testify. Her name is Margaret Hill." The name echoed through the courtroom like a bell struck in silence. Margaret Hill. I had not seen her enter, had not known she would appear today. Rebecca had mentioned only that Margaret might testify if circumstances required, but I had not expected those circumstances to arrive so soon or so dramatically. Judge Whitman looked toward the back of the room. "Is Mrs. Hill present?" A woman rose from the last row of the gallery. She was 70 years old, with silver hair pinned neatly back from a face that carried both gentleness and steel. She wore a simple dark blue dress, no jewelry except for a thin gold chain around her neck. When she walked toward the front of the courtroom, she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces designed to intimidate. I had known Margaret for over 40 years, but watching her now, I understood for the first time why Helen had trusted her with everything. Gregory Hale was on his feet before Margaret reached the witness stand. "Your Honor, I must object. This witness was not included on any list provided to us. We have had no opportunity to prepare for her testimony or challenge her qualifications." Rebecca stood as well. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hill is appearing as a rebuttal witness in response to the petitioner's claims regarding Mr. Whitaker's isolation and alleged incompetence. Her testimony is directly relevant to matters raised by opposing counsel during this hearing." Judge Whitman considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Mrs. Hill, please take the stand." Margaret settled into the witness chair with the composure of someone who had occupied similar seats many times before. The bailiff administered the oath, and she affirmed it in a clear, steady voice. Rebecca approached with a folder in her hands. "Mrs. Hill, could you please state your professional background for the court?" "Certainly." Margaret's voice carried easily through the room. "I practiced law for 40 years, specializing in elder law estate planning and cases involving financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. I retired 8 years ago, though I continue to consult on select cases." She paused. "I have testified as an expert witness in over 200 proceedings involving conservatorship disputes and elder abuse." The gallery stirred. Gregory Hale sank slightly in his chair. Whatever objection he had been preparing died on his lips. "And how do you know the defendant, Thomas Whitaker?" Rebecca asked. "Thomas is my oldest friend's husband." Margaret's eyes found mine across the room, and something soft passed between us. "Helen Whitaker and I met in college. We remained close for over 50 years until her death 5 years ago." "Did Helen ever discuss her concerns about her family's future with you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "She did. Helen came to me 15 years ago before her son Daniel had even married Vanessa." She looked toward the plaintiff's table where Vanessa sat frozen. Helen had concerns. She had noticed certain patterns in the woman Daniel was dating, behaviors that reminded her of cases I had described to her over the years. She asked me to help her establish legal protections for Thomas. "Protections against what?" Rebecca prompted. "Against the possibility of family betrayal." Margaret's voice remained steady, but I could hear the weight beneath it. Helen loved her son. She didn't want to believe he would ever harm his father, but she also understood that love can be manipulated, that good people can be led astray by those who see vulnerability as opportunity. She wanted to ensure that if anything ever happened to her, Thomas would have defenses in place. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even the reporters had stopped writing, their pens suspended above their notebooks. Vanessa's face had lost all color. Daniel stared at Margaret as if seeing a ghost. "Mrs. Hill," Rebecca said gently, "can you tell the court why Helen chose you specifically for this task?" Margaret was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice wavered for the first time. 25 years ago, my own son married a woman who saw him as a means to an end. She isolated him from his family, gained control of his finances, and when she had taken everything she wanted, she left him with nothing. Margaret paused, and I saw her hands tighten in her lap. My son took his own life. He couldn't bear the shame of what had happened, of how completely he had been deceived. A soft gasp rippled through the gallery. I felt my own chest constrict. Helen had told me about Margaret's son many years ago, but hearing it spoken aloud in this context gave the tragedy new weight. Helen knew my story. Margaret continued, her voice strengthening again. She came to me because she knew I would never let another family suffer the same fate, not if I could prevent it. She turned then and looked directly at Vanessa. The gaze held no hatred, no anger, only the cold clarity of recognition. Helen saw you clearly from the beginning, and she left something behind to prove it. Margaret's words hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. The courtroom remained frozen, every eye fixed on the witness stand, every breath held in anticipation of what would come next. I felt my heart beating against my ribs, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the seconds until the past would finally reveal itself. Rebecca approached the bench with a new folder. "Your Honor, I would like to submit additional evidence corroborating Mrs. Hill's testimony. These are documents compiled 15 years ago at the request of Helen Whitaker." Judge Whitman accepted the folder and began reviewing its contents. Gregory Hale rose to object, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your Honor, we have no way to verify the authenticity of documents allegedly created 15 years ago by a deceased individual." "The documents are notarized and dated," Rebecca replied calmly. "They include a report from a licensed private investigator whose credentials and current contact information are included for verification." The judge nodded. "I'll allow them. Please summarize the contents for the record." Margaret spoke from the witness stand, her voice carrying the weight of secrets held too long. 15 years ago, Helen became concerned about the woman her son was dating. She came to me and asked for advice. I recommended she hire a private investigator to look into Vanessa's background." Margaret paused, her eyes moving briefly to Vanessa, who sat rigid as stone. The investigator's findings were troubling. She opened her own copy of the documents. Before moving to this state, Vanessa had been romantically involved with an elderly widower named Robert Ashford in Florida. Mr. Ashford was 73 years old, recently bereaved, and possessed considerable assets. Vanessa became close to him over a period of 14 months. Margaret turned a page. Mr. Ashford died unexpectedly. His death was ruled natural causes, though his family raised questions that were never fully investigated. His estate, valued at approximately $2 million, went to a charitable trust that Vanessa had helped him establish 6 months before his death. She was listed as the trust's primary administrator. The gallery erupted in whispers. Judge Whitman called for order. Vanessa's attorney was on his feet objecting, but his words were lost in the commotion. Daniel stared at his wife with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something between horror and recognition. As if pieces of a puzzle he had refused to examine were finally clicking into place. Helen couldn't prove wrongdoing. Margaret continued when the room had quieted. The investigation found patterns, not evidence, but she knew what she was seeing. She had watched me lose my son to a woman with the same predatory instincts. She recognized the signs even if she couldn't prove them in court. Rebecca stepped forward. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to play a video recording made by Helen Whitaker approximately 3 months before her death." Judge Whitman considered for a moment, then nodded. "Proceed." A screen was wheeled into the courtroom, positioned so that everyone could see. Rebecca connected a laptop and pressed play. The screen flickered and then Helen appeared. My breath caught in my throat. She looked exactly as I remembered her from those final months, thin and pale, but still beautiful. Still possessed of the quiet strength that had defined her entire life. She sat in our living room in the chair by the window where she had always loved to read. The afternoon light fell across her face, softening the lines of illness. She looked directly into the camera, directly at me, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady. "Thomas, if you're seeing this, then what I feared has happened." The courtroom fell absolutely silent. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could only watch as my wife spoke to me from beyond the grave. "I investigated Vanessa before she married Daniel. I found a pattern. I recognized a way of targeting vulnerable people, of gaining trust before taking everything. I couldn't prove wrongdoing, but I could prepare you. Everything Margaret has, the trust documents, the legal protections, I built them for you. I built them because I knew I wouldn't always be there to protect you myself." Her image flickered slightly, a momentary distortion that made her seem even more like a ghost. Then she continued, and her voice grew softer, more intimate, as if we were alone in that room together. "I'm sorry I never told you. I didn't want to hurt Daniel. He loved her, or thought he did, and I couldn't bear to be the one who shattered that illusion. I kept hoping I was wrong, hoping she would prove to be better than my fears. But I couldn't risk your future on that hope." Tears were falling down my face now. I didn't try to stop them. I didn't care who saw. My wife was speaking to me, reaching across 5 years of silence to hold my hand one last time. "I love you, Thomas. I have loved you since the day we met, and I will love you long after I'm gone. Trust Margaret. She knows what to do. She will help you when the time comes." Helen paused, and something shifted in her expression. The softness gave way to steel, the same steel I'd seen in her eyes whenever she faced something that threatened our family. "And Thomas, remember this. You are not weak. You are not confused. You are not incompetent. You are the strongest man I've ever known, and no one, not Vanessa, not Daniel, not anyone, has the right to take your dignity from you. Fight for yourself. Fight for everything we built together. I will be with you every step of the way." The screen went dark. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the weight of Helen's words pressing down on everyone present. I sat with tears streaming down my face, my hands trembling on the table, overwhelmed by the realization that my wife's love had truly extended beyond death. Helen's voice faded, but her final words hung in the air. "I protected you the only way I knew how, by never letting you face this alone." The screen remained dark, but Helen's presence lingered in the courtroom like perfume after its wearer has left the room. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, not caring about appearances, not caring about the dozens of strangers who had just witnessed my grief laid bare. My wife had loved me enough to prepare for a future she would never see. The least I could do was honor that love by telling the truth. Rebecca touched my arm gently. "Thomas, would you like to testify?" I nodded and rose from my chair. My legs felt unsteady, but my mind was clear. I had carried this secret for 6 months, had played a role so convincingly that even my own son believed it. Now it was time to remove the mask. Judge Whitman watched me approach the witness stand with an expression that had shifted over the course of the hearing from neutrality to something approaching respect. The bailiff administered the oath, and I affirmed it, then settled into the chair that Margaret had occupied minutes before. From this vantage point, I could see the entire courtroom, the reporters with their notebooks, the spectators leaning forward in anticipation, Gregory Hale slumped in defeat at his table. And Daniel, my son, sat with his head bowed, his shoulders curved inward, a man whose world had collapsed around him. "Mr. Whitaker," Rebecca began, "could you please tell the court in your own words what happened 6 months ago?" I took a breath and let it out slowly. 6 months ago, I received an email from my son. It was sent to me by mistake. Daniel had intended to forward a message to Vanessa, but he typed my address instead of hers. I paused, letting the words settle. In that email, he outlined the conservatorship plan in detail. He discussed how to obtain fraudulent medical documentation, how to present normal behavior as evidence of decline, how to time the petition for maximum effect. He wrote that they needed to move quickly before I changed my trust documents. The gallery stirred. Daniel's head came up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time since the hearing began. I saw desperation there, and fear, and something that might have been the beginning of shame. When I read that email, I continued, I understood everything. I understood that my son had been planning to take away my autonomy, my dignity, my right to make decisions about my own life. I understood that the woman he married had found in him not just a partner, but a willing accomplice. I kept my voice steady, though each word cost me something I could not name, and I understood that I had a choice to make. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. What choice was that, Mr. Whitaker? I could have confronted them immediately. I could have called Daniel and demanded an explanation, could have cut them out of my life and changed my legal documents to protect myself. I shook my head slowly, but I realized that if I reacted, they would simply hide their tracks. They would find another way. They would wait until I let my guard down and try again. The only way to truly protect myself was to let them believe their plan was working. I looked at Daniel as I spoke the next words, so I did nothing. I let them think I was confused, weak, afraid. When Daniel brought me documents to sign, I signed them without reading, just as he expected. When Vanessa made comments about my memory, I pretended not to notice. Every meeting, every manipulation, every insult I documented. I recorded conversations in accordance with state law. I kept copies of every paper they put in front of me. My voice hardened. I gave you every chance to stop, Daniel. Every chance to look at what you were doing and pull back. You never did. Daniel's face crumpled. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Vanessa sat beside him like a statue, her earlier composure replaced by the blank expression of someone who has realized too late that they have underestimated their opponent. I didn't do this for revenge, I said, and I meant it. The anger I had felt 6 months ago had long since burned away, leaving only clarity behind. I did it because my wife asked me to trust her. Helen prepared these protections because she loved me and because she saw a threat I refused to acknowledge. Honoring her memory meant using the tools she gave me, meant trusting Margaret and Rebecca, meant having the patience to let the truth reveal itself. I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say, and I did it because I needed to know. I needed to know, truly know, who my son had become. I kept hoping I was wrong. I kept hoping Daniel would wake up one morning and realize what he was doing, would come to me and confess, would choose his father over his greed. My voice broke slightly on the last word. He never did. And now I know. The courtroom was silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, their pens suspended above their notebooks. Judge Whitman sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Gregory Hale stared at the table in front of him, as if wishing he could disappear into the wood. Then Daniel's voice broke across the silence. Dad, I'm sorry. The words came out ragged, torn from somewhere deep inside him. He half rose from his chair, his hand extended toward me as if reaching across the years of betrayal and broken trust. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at my son. I looked at the face I had loved since the moment he was born. The eyes that had once gazed at me with trust and admiration, the mouth that had called me daddy before it learned to call me an obstacle. I felt something shift in my chest, a door closing that I knew would never open again. I raised my hand and Daniel fell silent. The time for sorry was 6 months ago, I said quietly. Now it's time for the truth. The truth. The words seemed to echo through the courtroom, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls and settling into the silence like dust after a collapse. I stepped down from the witness stand and returned to my seat beside Rebecca, feeling the weight of every eye in the room following my movements. Daniel remained frozen at the plaintiff's table, his hand still extended toward empty air, his face a mask of devastation. But it was Vanessa who drew my attention now. Vanessa, whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her with every passing second. She had been sitting rigidly throughout my testimony, her posture so controlled it seemed almost mechanical. But as I took my seat, I saw something shift behind her eyes. The composure she had maintained through Helen's video, through Margaret's testimony, through the revelation of the emails, finally reached its breaking point. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles, white fingers trembling with barely contained fury. Judge Whitman began to speak something about procedural next steps, but she never finished the sentence. Vanessa rose from her chair without permission, her movement so abrupt that Gregory Hale flinched beside her. This is a setup. Her voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, high and sharp with desperation. He's a manipulative old man who has been planning this for months. He tricked us. He pretended to be confused and weak so he could trap us. Judge Whitman's gavel came down hard. Mrs. Whitaker, you will sit down immediately. Vanessa did not sit. Her eyes were wild now, darting around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. He planned this every moment of it. He's been recording us illegally, violating our privacy, building a case based on stolen conversations. She pointed at me, her fingers shaking. This man is not a victim. He's a predator wearing the mask of a helpless old fool. The bailiff moved toward her, but Judge Whitman held up a hand, her expression hardening into something that promised consequences. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm warning you. Sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of this court. Rebecca rose calmly, her voice a stark contrast to Vanessa's hysteria. Your Honor, I would like to address the allegation of illegal recording. She lifted a document from her folder. All recordings made by Mr. Whitaker were conducted in full compliance with state law. This is a one-party consent state, meaning that any party to a conversation may record it without the knowledge or consent of other participants. Mr. Whitaker was present for every conversation he recorded. Every recording is legal, admissible, and authentic. The words landed like hammer blows. I watched Vanessa's face as her final legal argument evaporated, as the last fragile hope she had been clinging to dissolved into nothing. Her breathing grew rapid, shallow, her chest rising and falling with the desperate rhythm of someone who has just realized there is no escape. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, that's not right. That can't be right. Gregory Hale reached for her arm. Vanessa, please sit down. Let me handle this. She yanked away from him with surprising violence. Handle it, handle it. You've done nothing but lose since this hearing started. She spun back toward the judge, toward me, toward the gallery full of witnesses documenting her destruction. You don't understand. We were just trying to protect ourselves. The courtroom went absolutely still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to pause in its rotation. Vanessa's voice rose higher, cracking with panic. Do you know how much he's worth? Do you have any idea? The properties, the investments, the trust funds, all of it just sitting there while he gets older and more confused. We couldn't just wait around for him to... She stopped. The words died in her throat as the realization of what she had just said washed over her face. The color drained from her cheeks. Her mouth hung open, frozen mid-sentence, as if she could somehow take back the admission that had just escaped. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Gregory Hale put his head in his hands. Daniel stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, as if the woman standing before him was a stranger who had somehow replaced the person he thought he knew. In the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every moment of Vanessa's self-destruction for tomorrow's headlines. I felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication. I had spent 40 years building structures designed to carry weight, to withstand pressure, to hold firm when everything around them threatened to collapse. I understood that some structures fail not because of external forces, but because of flaws in their own design. Vanessa had built her entire life on a foundation of manipulation and greed, and now that foundation was giving way beneath her. Judge Whitman let the silence stretch for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Vanessa, with an expression that mixed judicial authority with something approaching pity. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow and deliberate, each word weighted with significance. Mrs. Whitaker, I strongly advise you to stop talking. She paused, letting the warning settle. But I suspect you just said everything this court needed to hear. Judge Whitman nodded to the bailiff, and two officers moved toward Vanessa with practiced efficiency. She did not resist as they took her arms and guided her toward the side door. The fight had drained out of her completely, replaced by a hollow numbness that made her movements mechanical, puppet-like. As she passed the plaintiff's table, she looked at Daniel one final time. He did not return her gaze. The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to punctuate the end of something far larger than a court hearing. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet. Spectators shifted in their seats. Reporters continued their frantic note-taking. Gregory Hale sat motionless, staring at the documents scattered before him, as if they belonged to someone else's case, someone else's catastrophic failure. And Daniel remained at the plaintiff's table alone, now his wife removed and his attorney defeated, with nothing left to shield him from the wreckage of his own choices. I watched my son from across the room. He was 43 years old, but in that moment he looked like a child who had wandered too far from home and could not find his way back. His face was pale, drained of all color, his hands trembling visibly against the wooden table. He had not moved since Vanessa's outburst, had not spoken, had barely seemed to breathe. The emails, the videos, my testimonies, everything had been laid bare before the court and before him, and now he sat in the ruins of a plan that had seemed so certain just hours ago. Judge Whitman cleared her throat. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this hearing, I am calling a brief recess to allow all parties to compose themselves. We will reconvene in 15 minutes to discuss next steps. She rose, and the bailiff called for everyone to stand. The judge disappeared through her private door, and the courtroom exhaled. I didn't move immediately. I sat at the defendant's table watching Daniel waiting for something I could not name. Rebecca touched my arm and whispered that she would give me a moment, then gathered her papers and stepped away. The gallery began to empty as people filed out for coffee or fresh air, or simply distance from the emotional intensity of what they had witnessed. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty. Only Daniel and I remained separated by 20 feet of polished floor and 43 years of history. Slowly, I rose and walked toward the plaintiff's table. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness. Daniel heard me coming, but did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the table and his hands on anything that was not his father's face. I stopped a few feet away and waited. Finally, he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and broken. "Dad, I never meant—" He swallowed hard, struggling to find words that would not come. "I just wanted—" "You wanted what you weren't willing to wait for," I said quietly. The words came out steady, though each one cost me something I would never recover. "You wanted what you weren't willing to earn. That's not something you can apologize away, Daniel." He flinched as if I had struck him. His eyes finally rose to meet mine, and I saw tears gathering there, spilling over onto cheeks that had gone gray with shame. I know I can't fix this, but you have to understand," Vanessa said. "Don't." My voice sharpened, cutting him off. "Don't blame her, not now. I saw the emails. I heard your words. You weren't following her lead. You were walking beside her step for step, choice for choice." I let that truth settle between us. Vanessa may have encouraged, you may have validated your worst impulses, but the decision to betray your father was yours alone. Daniel's face crumpled. The tears came freely now, streaming down his cheeks, his breath hitching with barely suppressed sobs. He looked like the boy I had comforted through nightmares, the teenager I had counseled through heartbreak, the young man I had watched walk across a stage to receive his diploma. He looked like my son, and yet he was also the man who had planned to erase my autonomy for money, who had sat across from me at family dinners while calculating how to steal my future. "I raised you to be honest," I said, and my voice wavered despite my efforts to control it. "I taught you that integrity mattered more than wealth, that family was sacred, that trust once broken could never be fully repaired. Your mother believed in you until her last breath. She worried about Vanessa, but she never stopped believing that you would do the right thing if it came to that." I paused, feeling the weight of what I was about to say. "And you repaid that belief by planning to take everything while she was still warm in her grave. The emails started 18 months ago, Daniel. Your mother had been dead less than 4 years. Her memory was still fresh, her photographs still on our walls, and you were already scheming to have me declared incompetent." Daniel broke. His shoulders heaved, his body folding in on itself as sobs racked through him. He pressed his hands against his face, trying to contain the grief and shame that poured out of him, but there was no containing it. The sounds he made were raw animal, the sounds of a man confronting the full horror of what he had become. I stood and watched him cry. I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not offer words of reassurance or promises that everything would be all right. Some wounds cannot be healed with hugs. Some betrayals cut so deep that the scar tissue never fully forms. I loved my son. Part of me would always love him. But love and trust are not the same thing, and he had destroyed the latter completely. After a long moment, Daniel's sobs subsided into shaky breaths. He lowered his hands and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, his face swollen and blotched with tears. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Will you ever forgive me?" I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought of Helen, of the life we had built together, of the boy Daniel had been, and the man he had become. I thought of the envelope still sitting in my desk drawer, the one Helen had left for me, the one I had finally opened after her video played in this courtroom. I thought of all the moments we could never get back, and all the trust that could never be rebuilt. "I don't know," I said finally, "but today is not that day." The recess ended and the courtroom filled again with spectators and reporters eager to witness the conclusion of what had become the most dramatic hearing this county had seen in years. Daniel returned to the plaintiff's table, his eyes still red, his movements slow and heavy. Vanessa was brought back by the bailiff and seated beside him, though she kept her gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the man she had married. Gregory Hale shuffled his papers without purpose, a captain going through the motions on a sinking ship. Judge Whitman entered, and we rose, then sat again as she settled into her chair. She took a long moment to review her notes, her expression unreadable. The ceiling fan turned overhead. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the room in the amber glow of approaching evening. I folded my hands on the table and waited for the words that would determine what remained of my family. This court has heard extensive testimony and reviewed substantial evidence over the course of this hearing. Judge Whitman began, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "The petition before me requests conservatorship over Thomas Whitaker on grounds of diminished mental capacity and financial mismanagement. Having considered all evidence presented, I find these claims to be not only unsubstantiated but deliberately fabricated." She paused, her gaze moving to the plaintiff's table. "The petitioners presented falsified medical documentation, manipulated financial records, and coordinated testimony designed to create the appearance of incompetence where none exists. Email evidence authenticated by forensic experts demonstrates that this petition was planned over 18 months ago with the explicit intent of gaining control over Mr. Whitaker's assets." The courtroom was silent. Vanessa sat rigid. Daniel stared at the table. "Therefore, I'm denying the petition for conservatorship in its entirety." Judge Whitman's gavel came down once, a clean, sharp sound. "Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of attempted elder financial abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Both petitioners should be aware that criminal charges may result from this referral." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. I heard someone behind me whisper, "Justice," with quiet satisfaction. But I felt no satisfaction, only the hollow relief of a man who has survived a storm and now surveys the damage left behind. Judge Whitman was not finished. "I would also note for the record that the conduct of counsel for the petitioners raises serious ethical concerns. Mr. Hale, I will be filing a complaint with the State Bar Association regarding your participation in this matter." Gregory Hale's face went gray. He nodded once, accepting the blow without protest. There was nothing left to protest. As the judge concluded her remarks and prepared to adjourn, Margaret rose from her seat in the gallery and approached Rebecca. They exchanged a few quiet words, and then Rebecca stood to address the court one final time. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to enter into the record one additional matter relevant to the disposition of this case." Judge Whitman nodded. Rebecca continued. "The Whitaker Family Trust, established by Helen Whitaker 15 years ago, contains a no-contest clause. This clause stipulates that any beneficiary who initiates legal proceedings challenging Mr. Thomas Whitaker's competency or control over his assets automatically forfeits their inheritance." Daniel's head came up sharply. For the first time since the hearing resumed, he showed something other than defeat shock, and beneath it, the dawning horror of understanding. "By filing this conservatorship petition," Rebecca continued, "Daniel Whitaker has triggered that clause. He has forfeited all claim to the trust's assets. Per Mrs. Helen Whitaker's instructions, those assets will now be transferred to a charitable foundation established in her name, dedicated to protecting elderly victims of family exploitation." The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Helen had built a fortress around me, and the very act of attacking that fortress had destroyed any claim Daniel might have had to what lay inside. My wife had seen this moment coming 15 years ago, had planned for it with the same meticulous care she brought to everything she loved. Even in death, she had protected me. Even in death, she had ensured that betrayal would carry consequences. Judge Whitman adjourned the hearing. The courtroom began to empty. I rose slowly, feeling the ache in my bones that comes from hours of sitting in hard wooden chairs, from carrying tension in muscles that had forgotten how to relax. Rebecca gathered her documents and offered me a small, weary smile. Margaret came to stand beside me, her hand resting briefly on my arm. "Helen would be proud," she said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps. I stood near the entrance watching as Vanessa emerged through the doors with Daniel trailing behind her. She had her phone in her hand, and as I watched, she stopped abruptly, her face draining of what little color remained. I learned later what those messages contained. Her employer had terminated her position effective immediately, citing conduct unbecoming and potential legal liability. The documentation of her scheme had been forwarded to her company's HR department that morning by Margaret, who believed employers had a right to know when their employees engaged in elder abuse. Her own parents, horrified by the publicity and the revelations about Robert Ashford, had released a statement to local media disowning their daughter and expressing sympathy for the Whitaker family. And a reporter from a national outlet was already approaching her on the courthouse steps asking questions about an elderly widower in Florida who had died under unclear circumstances. Vanessa's world had collapsed completely. Everything she had built, every relationship she had cultivated, every carefully constructed facade had crumbled in a single afternoon. She stood on those courthouse steps with her phone in her hand and her life in ruins. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged as a scream directed at the only target within reach. "This is your fault." She spun toward Daniel, her face contorted with rage. "Everything is destroyed because of you. You couldn't even delete your emails properly." Daniel did not respond. He stood on the steps below her, his hands hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on nothing. The man who had planned to take everything from his father now had nothing left himself. No inheritance, no wife who loved him, no father who trusted him, no future that did not include the possibility of criminal prosecution. Vanessa screamed at him again, words I could not make out over the noise of the gathering crowd, but Daniel just stared at his hands and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I turned away from the scene on the courthouse steps and walked down the sidewalk alone. Behind me, Vanessa's voice continued to rise in fury, but the words grew fainter with each step I took. Reporters rushed past me toward the commotion cameras, raised hungry for footage of the final act of destruction. None of them noticed the old man in the gray coat moving quietly in the opposite direction. I preferred it that way. Rebecca caught up with me at the corner. She was slightly out of breath, her briefcase clutched against her chest. "Thomas, let me drive you home. It's been a long day." I shook my head. "Thank you, but I need to walk. I need to think." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized grief that required solitude. "Call me if you need anything. Anytime." I promised I would, and then I walked. The autumn air was cool against my face, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The streets of the town where I had lived for 3 decades passed by in a blur of familiar storefronts and remembered conversations. I walked past the hardware store where I had bought supplies for countless home repairs, past the cafe where Helen and I had eaten breakfast every Sunday morning, past the church where we had renewed our vows on our 40th anniversary. Each landmark held a memory, a fragment of the life we had built together, the life that had nearly been stolen from me. By the time I reached my house, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon. I let myself in through the front door and stood for a moment in the hallway listening to the silence. Helen's photographs still lined the walls. Her favorite reading chair still sat by the window. The lilies I watered each morning still bloomed in their pot on the kitchen windowsill. She was everywhere in this house, woven into every corner and surface, a presence that death had diminished but could never erase. I went to my study and opened the desk drawer where I had kept her envelope for 5 years. The paper was slightly yellowed now, the edges soft from occasional handling. I had held it many times since her death, had run my fingers over her handwriting, had wondered what words she had left for me. But I had never opened it. Some part of me had known that doing so would mean accepting a truth I was not ready to face. Now I was ready. I slid my finger under the seal and withdrew a single page folded twice. Her handwriting filled the paper, the familiar loops and curves that I would recognize anywhere in any lifetime. "My dearest Thomas," she had written. "If you're reading this, then you've learned the truth about Vanessa. I'm sorry I kept it from you. I wanted to protect Daniel. I wanted to believe he would be strong enough to resist her. I was wrong about him, but I was never wrong about you. You are the most honest man I've ever known. Whatever happens, know this. I never stopped protecting you even when I could no longer hold your hand. All my love forever, Helen." I read the letter 3 times, letting each word settle into my heart. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my breast pocket, close to the place where she had always lived. The cemetery was quiet in the fading light. I parked near the old oak tree that Helen had loved and walked the familiar path to her headstone. The marble gleamed softly in the amber glow of sunset, her name carved in letters that would outlast us all. I knelt and placed the flowers I had brought, white lilies, like the ones she had grown in our garden, and then I sat beside her on the grass. "You were right about everything," I said quietly. "You always were." The sky deepened from gold to rose to purple as I sat there. Birds settled into the trees for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the hour. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The grief I had carried for 5 years had transformed into something else, something that felt less like loss and more like gratitude. Helen had loved me enough to prepare for a future she would never see. She had trusted me enough to believe I would find my way through. And she had been right, as she always was, about everything that mattered. I stayed until the stars began to appear scattered across the darkening sky like promises kept. Then I rose, touched her headstone one final time, and walked back to my car. The house would be quiet when I returned. The bed would be empty. But I was not alone. I had never been alone. Helen's love had followed me through every moment of this ordeal, guiding me, protecting me, reminding me of who I was when the world tried to convince me I was someone else. Some victories are not about winning. They are about remembering who you are and who loved you enough to make sure you would never forget. 6 months later, the Helen Whitaker Foundation opened its doors. Margaret Hill serves as its director, and Rebecca continues to fight for elderly victims of family exploitation across the state. The foundation has already helped dozens of seniors reclaim their dignity and their rights from those who sought to steal both. Daniel pleaded guilty to attempted elder financial abuse and received 3 years probation with mandatory counseling. I have not spoken to him since the courthouse steps. Perhaps one day I will. Perhaps forgiveness will find its way back into my heart. But that day has not yet arrived, and I have learned not to rush the healing of wounds this deep. Vanessa faces federal charges related to Robert Ashford's estate. The investigation is ongoing. I do not follow the news about her anymore. She has taken enough of my attention for one lifetime. As for me, I wake each morning and water Helen's lilies. I visit her grave every Sunday with fresh flowers. I live in the house we built together, surrounded by memories that no longer bring only pain. I am 68 years old, and I have learned that love does not end with death. It simply finds new ways to reach us. If this story moved you, I ask only this: check on the elders in your life. Listen to them. Believe them when they speak of mistreatment. And never underestimate the quiet strength of those who have spent a lifetime learning when to wait and when to act. Thank you for staying until the end. If you found meaning in Thomas's journey, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me about a time when love protected you in ways you never expected. Subscribe so you never miss another story. And remember, the strongest bridges are built not